Hello and welcome. Some of you have told me that you would like to see more detail about rolling out and preparing cinnamon roll dough. Now Gidget, let me tell you in particular, this is much more easier than it looks. You don't have to be intimidated, and you do deserve those sticky buns and cinnamon rolls. This concept is really easy once you get started, and I'm going to show you all the basics and the pitfalls and how to correct mistakes as you make them. Maggie's going to be following along and helping us make this recipe as well. The first thing you need to decide is if you're going to use a casserole dish or if you're going to use a cookie sheet or even a pan. We're going to go through like the traditional casserole dish as you see here. And because this is typically left in after you bake them, you're going to have to prepare it with some kind of cooking spray because butter's just not going to cut it unless you remove them pretty quickly. They are going to stick if you use just butter. And oil tends to stick to your pan as well and makes them too crispy on the edges. Now if you get any on the sides of your pan, you want to take time to wipe it off with a clean damp cloth or a paper towel because it will bake onto that glass and make it sticky, and also it's very slippery when you're putting it into the oven. But what if all you have is a cake pan like this? That is perfectly fine. Aluminum works great for them. Now when it comes to aluminum, they do bake faster, so you're going to have to bake them at a lower temperature, or you're going to have to bake them for less time than you would a glass pan. And these you want to go ahead and try to remove them from your pan before you ice them. So what I like to do is just use a little stick of softened butter, and it's really soft where you can do what I'm doing here and just smear it all over the pan, the bottom and the sides completely. It's about a teaspoon's worth of butter, but you can be generous here and you can go up to a tablespoon of butter if you really want that buttery flavor on the outside of your cinnamon rolls. Now you don't have to use butter, but I found that it just tastes better that way. And again, you can use the cooking spray here as well. You also can use a non-stick pan. If you do use a non-stick pan, never ever use non-stick cooking spray on it. It will adhere to the non-stick surface and get this film coating on it. You'll never get it off. Even with baking soda and salt, it just doesn't come clean. Now let's talk about this dough. It should be double in size and it should be nice and bubbly like this, but it shouldn't collapse when you press down onto it. You want it to just still be rising. So you're gonna get a feel for it the more you bake bread. And don't worry if it does collapse, you can still use it. It's just not going to be as fluffy as if you got it at the right timing. And it's okay, you learn with practice, so just keep making it. Now see how you can put your fingers in it and it doesn't collapse and it holds the shape? That's kind of how you know the dough is ready, and it's nice and stretchy as you're pulling it out and it's not collapsing immediately. Now it will collapse if you put pressure on it, but it's going to hold its shape well. And you want to take your time and get all that dough out of your bowl if you can possibly do so, because you don't want to waste any of that precious dough you spent rising. If you need a recipe for cinnamon rolls, I have a ton on my website, but I'll also link one below and give you one in the description so you can make some yourself. Now some recipes are stickier than others, and you may need to sprinkle some flour onto your work surface and onto your rolling pin. But that's not always a necessary thing depending on what the recipe states. What's really helpful is if you pat it into a rectangular shape before you even bring your rolling pin out. And you don't even need a rolling pin, and we will go through how to use both a rolling pin and just your hands in case you don't have a rolling pin to make cinnamon rolls. A good rule of thumb is to make these 9 by 12, but if you don't have a ruler, one of these pans is 9 by 13, so just make it about the size of the pan and then just cut them from there. And just eyeball 12 pieces. And I'm just kind of giving myself a visual of where to go, and then I'm just going to set the ruler aside and just kind of roll this back and forth. Now as you're rolling out the dough, see how it's relaxing and it's wanting to bounce back in some places. This is very typical. They don't tell you this happens. You want it to do that, so lift it up occasionally, let it relax, let it bounce back, and then just kind of just stretch it into shape gently. If it starts to tear, let it sit a few minutes. Just letting the glutens relax and chill out will make it a lot easier to roll this out. Now, what if you didn't like the way it looked? You can just fold it over in half like I'm doing here, and then just stretch it out again. See how it's really wanting to bounce back on me because I'm trying to finagle the dough too much? That's okay. That's just showing that I am working the dough too hard and I just need to take my time. So I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to let it get out of shape and show you how I fix it. I just basically take my hands and I square it back up. Now when you do that, sometimes the edges get a little taller than the rest of it, so you just want to take your hand and just kind of pat it down to make it a more even layer. Then pick back up your rolling pin and then just try to push it back into the shape you're wanting or the size. And again, you're going to see it fight with you. Just take your time, and if you want to, take a few moments break and let that dough relax and it will shape up for you more. Then once more, when you're really close, go ahead and lift it up off the counter, let it relax yet again, and then press it back down into shape. And all this does is just makes it really easy when you go to roll this up. It's not going to be sticking to the counter, and it's not going to get out of shape as you roll it up. And I like to do all the sides like this. You're going to have a much better cinnamon roll if you take your time and let it do the thing it wants to do. Now you just take a quick measurement and see where you're at. And I'm getting pretty close here, but I don't like that it's not square enough, so I'm just going to kind of push it into shape again. I'm going to flatten it out with my fingertips so it's kind of even all throughout, and then I'm going to use my rolling pin and roll it again. See, a lot of people, including myself, cut all this out because it just takes a while. So you think it's really easy to do and it takes no time at all, and it is easy, but it is time consuming. Now do you see why I cut a lot of this out and why other people cut it out? It does take a while, and then it makes you think that you're doing something wrong because you think that people on baking shows have no problems whatsoever getting this into shape because they show you the beginning process and then the end, and you're going, why am I fighting with this dough? And they don't seem to have any problems at all. Well, a lot of times they do, they just don't show you the whole process. Now, did you notice that after just letting this dough relax for just a few moments while I was describing some of the process, it started to let me roll it out more and it's not fighting me? That's what I was talking about, if you just give it time. And I'm just going to check the measurements again, and I'm getting really close here. But then this edge is not straight. Again, I'm just going to take my fingers and I'm going to square it up, and then I'm going to take my palm of my hand and flatten down that ridge so it's more even and level. And you'll feel that the dough isn't level if you use the palm of your hand. And I'm just pressing it down into shape. Now what I'm doing at the end is I'm just flattening it out with my hands where I feel ridges. You don't have to do this. All it's going to do is just not have a uniform look to it at the end. It's not a huge deal. They still taste the same. They're just not as pretty. Once you have verified your measurements are where you like it, then you're going to put on your butter. And you want really soft, spreadable butter. You want to be able to spread it really easily. If you find that it's starting to tear, then you can try to put little tiny pieces on. But you want to keep that bottom edge clear of butter and topping, and I'm going to show you one with it and without it, and what happens if you put it on the edge and what happens if you leave that little edge free of everything. What I like to do is just put little dabs of butter all throughout the dough, and that just helps you spread it easier. You don't want the butter to be so soft that it's oily, because then it's going to make your cinnamon rolls kind of greasy tasting, and that's just not really ideal. So let me tell you something that a lot of times I will do, and I'm going to show you a trick here. If you are finding this just so difficult to spread out with a knife or the back of a spoon, you can use your hands. And what I like about your hands is your hands will heat up the butter a little bit, and it'll make it really easy to spread it out onto your dough. But it is a messy process, so you have to decide how comfortable you are with making a mess in the kitchen. And how easy it is to spread and get an even layer is just so worth it. Now, a lot of recipes will tell you to use a ton of butter, and let me tell you, a lot of times all that excess butter makes the cinnamon sugar just ooze out onto the bottom of your baking tray. So it's not a great idea to add more butter just because you like butter. If you really like butter, put some on top after you've baked it. Now see how much faster that was, spreading that out by hand, but of course your hands are messy and you need to go clean them off before you go to the next step, because if not, it's just going to be really hard to roll out this dough and cut it. When it comes to putting the cinnamon sugar mixture onto your cinnamon rolls, you do want to try to avoid putting it on the very edge. they say, because they say it's easier to roll up. So we're going to do one with an edge free of filling and one all the way to the edge. So now you just want to dust off your hands and you want to start rolling this up. And you want to just try to roll it up evenly and gently but firmly at the same time. Sometimes when you start to roll it up, the other edge will fall back in place. That's okay, just go back and start rolling it again. Then you just continue to roll down toward you. If it starts to get over the edges of the dough, just kind of shove them back with the palm of your hand like I'm doing here, and then continue to roll up. Some of the sugar mixture will fall out on the sides. That's perfectly normal. Don't worry about it. If you are making more than one batch, you can always scrape that back into the bowl and reuse that cinnamon mixture. Or you can even sprinkle it on top of your cinnamon rolls inside the baking pan. Now you just want to pick it up and let it relax, and then try to measure it and get it cut into 12 equal pieces. Sometimes you make them a little bit bigger than the 12 inches that you set out for. That's okay, just make them a little bit bigger. What I find helpful is to just go ahead and mark lines so you know basically where to cut them, and then you can go from there. Now, the best way to cut these is to use a serrated knife because they won't collapse the dough. If you use a sharp knife, you won't get that nice swirl. It should look like this. The other side, people sometimes tell you to discard these, but I don't. I just put the not so pretty side on the bottom, and I use them anyway because I think they taste fabulous even though they don't have as much cinnamon mixture in them as the other pieces will. And you want to space these evenly apart on your pan like I'm doing here. Now if you want to use the dental floss method, you pick up the dough, you put it underneath the dough, you crisscross it, and you pull sharply and fast. And it will also give you a really nice swirl, but you'll lose a lot more filling when you use the dental floss method. And it doesn't seem to want to hold its shape as well. So I really prefer to use the serrated knife the more I use it, even though everybody else tells you to use dental floss. And I used to be a proponent of the dental floss too, until I really discovered that the serrated knife really gives you the perfect cinnamon roll. So if you don't have a rolling pin, you can still make these, and you can make them by hand. You could also use a drinking glass or a wine bottle, but you really don't even need that. You just pat it into a rough rectangle like this, and then pick up the dough from one of the edges and let it dangle just a little bit, and then put it back on the counter, and it makes it even more stretchy for you. And using my hands and my palms, I'm just patting it into a rough rectangle until I get the shape and size that I want. If I don't have a ruler, I'm going to use the bottom of my pan for a general guideline. And by using the palms of your hands, you're going to be able to feel pretty much if it's level or not, but you may get some low spots and some high spots that you just can't get perfect without the rolling pin. However, they still taste absolutely amazing, and you're not going to care if it's not as uniform as if you used a rolling pin. You're just going to be excited you're eating wonderful, sticky, gooey cinnamon rolls. And then again, you just want to pick up the dough and stretch it occasionally. Let it relax if it's going to bounce back on you. But I found that it doesn't bounce back on you as much when you're using your hands versus the rolling pin. If you notice the rectangle isn't perfect when you use your hands, it's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. No one cares. You're not selling these for a profit. You are only making these to enjoy for yourself and your family and friends. What they do care about is how they taste. And we're not going to show this whole process because we showed it earlier, but I will tell you I'm going to go to the very edge, unlike I did earlier, because I want you to see the difference between the two. So that way you can make a call on whether or not you want to leave that edge clean. And then you just want to roll this up like you did before, and we're going to cut it exactly the same way. See how it's not really holding together as I'm picking it up and I'm having to roll them back together? That's what happens when you put the cinnamon roll mixture all the way to the edge. And if you notice on the counter, I'm losing a lot of cinnamon roll mixture. So that will help you determine whether or not you want to go all the way to the edge or leave a little bit of a clearance. So this is our first batch that we made that was with the rolling pin. If you look really closely, the swirls are pretty uniform. They are the same thickness overall, and they're sticking pretty well to the edges where we didn't put that cinnamon mixture. You want to cover the top of this with some saran wrap so that they won't dry out as they're rising. And you want to let these rise until they are at least double in size and they start to come together. I found that 45 minutes to an hour works really well in my kitchen. I'm usually around 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees Celsius in my house to give you a general guideline of how long it might take for you. The warmer your house is, the quicker they rise, the colder it is, the longer it takes to rise. Now notice these are the ones that were done by hand and the mixture came all the way to the edge. See how the little tails don't want to tuck in? That's what the main difference is when you take the filling all the way to the edge. And they aren't as uniform. They're kind of a little bit wonky shape in some places than others, but they still look like cinnamon rolls, don't they? Okay, so here we are about an hour later, and these are the ones we did by hand. If you notice, the little tails work themselves out, so everything's okay in the end. Now what will happen is when you go to pull these apart after they bake, they sometimes will stick together, and that's where they will start to frustrate you. And notice some of them, like the little guy that is a little squished more than the others, and it kind of puffed up in the center instead. That's typically normal. They're still going to bake up well and they're still going to be delicious. So we're going to set this one aside and we're going to look at the one that is the rolling pin. These are the ones done with the rolling pin. They crowded in the pan a little bit because this pan's slightly smaller. And if you notice the tops of them kind of puff up out of the middle, that's perfectly normal. It's not ideal if you're a bakery, but it's fine for if you're at home. No one really cares, as long as they taste good, remember. But that's kind of the main differences you'll see by doing it by hand versus using a rolling pin. So now we're going to pop these in the oven and we're going to come back 20 to 30 minutes later and let you see what they look like done. So I baked these for about 25 minutes and I let the temperature in the middle get to 190 degrees Fahrenheit or 88 degrees Celsius. And this is what they look like. These are the ones baked in the pan and the ones done with the rolling pin. We want to remove these from the pan immediately because of that butter. They will start to stick as they cool, but you need to do this carefully. You want to flip it upside down onto a cooling rack or a baking sheet and then just remove the baking pan. Then you're going to flip them right side up again and let them cool completely before you ice them. Now you can wait about 10 minutes before you start to ice them, but if you ice them earlier than that, they're just going to slide right off and you're going to have a big puddle of icing on your counter. So it's best to let them cool at least 20 to 30 minutes before you start icing them. Now these we are leaving in the pan and we're going to let them cool. Okay, now if you have removed them from the pan, you want to put something underneath them. Now this icing is a very thick consistency, and if you try to drizzle it, it's just not going to work out really well. It's going to look like kind of a mess, but let me try again to see if it's just me. No, it's the icing. And some people will tell you you need a real thick icing. Well, if you want to do a drizzle pattern, you actually want a thinner icing. We're not going to get that here now, are we? So what could we do to fix this issue? Because they look a hot mess. And now you're just kind of embarrassed about what they look like. You kind of try to fix it and it's just making it worse. Well, let me tell you, this is when you just layer it on top. You could keep trying your best to fix it and I'm telling you, it's not going to work. Let me show you. Like, it just keeps getting worse and worse looking no matter what you try. Would you think that these looked great? No, you'd probably still eat them because you know cinnamon rolls taste wonderful, but you'd be wondering, what in the world was Sarah thinking when she made these for me? Does she not know how to ice something? So instead, just take your spatula when you have this really thick icing and just spread it out on top of each cinnamon roll. It will look so much better, and honestly, it's going to taste amazing if you like a lot of icing. And if you want some of the cinnamon roll to show through, you just scrape some of the icing off as you go, and you'll get like a hint of a cinnamon roll underneath it. You can make this as thick as you like or as thin. If you want them really thick, you can double the recipe and just continue to ice them until your heart's content. So I'm going to spread this out onto them and I'll come back and let you see what they look like in the end. Don't these look so much better than what I started out with that drizzling mess? Already they look much prettier and they are fancier looking and they look like some of those ones you used to buy in the store that are just covered in icing. If you really like a lot of icing on your cinnamon rolls, this is the way to go. Now, if you don't like a lot of icing on your cinnamon rolls, that's perfectly okay. I will show you with the next batch what you can do. So now we have our cinnamon rolls that we want to make them drizzled. See how much thinner this consistency is? All you want to do is just add more milk into them until you have a really thin mixture, and then you just drizzle it with a spoon and see how much better this is already looking. Now, full disclosure, it's never going to look great when I do this because I still have that messed up shoulder, but it does look much prettier than it did before, you have to admit. So just by thinning out your icing, you can really get it drizzled. And if you wanted to make it perfect, you could put it in a piping bag and get more control. But this will end up looking really good, especially if you do some crisscross patterns to get it to look really nice. So one thing that you want to be aware of is, what if you tried to ice these on the top like we did earlier with the thicker icing? They're going to make the big mess. They're actually going to pull into the pan itself, and they're not going to look as pretty. And they're going to actually make your cinnamon rolls a little bit soggy as they dry, especially if you leave them into this pan. But I wanted you to see some of the pitfalls that you can do and screw up when you're making cinnamon rolls, so you know to prevent it in the future. So we're just going to drizzle a ton of this on here on a few of the cinnamon rolls, and we're going to sacrifice them, and don't worry, they'll still get eaten. If you just notice, Scout is telling me to hurry up. She's wanting fed. So I'm going to hurry up this process so she won't tear up my apron here with her little claws. So I'll come back after I've iced 4 of them, and then you can see what it looks like. As you notice, the 4 up here, they're very soupy looking, and they're actually starting to pull into the centers of the others, and it's starting to ooze out of them, and they just have all come off the top of them, and they don't look as pretty as the ones we did earlier. This is because our icing was too thin. It had nothing to do with the heat of the cinnamon rolls. But look at the ones at the bottom where we had that crisscross pattern. They do look actually really nice now that they have cooled. So that's a couple things that you can do to make them look really good or look really bad. But again, they all taste really good except for the really soupy ones. They're not going to be as nice as these really thick icing ones. These are going to be much better than these little soupy ones. I mean, look at them. Which ones would you rather eat? Soupy cinnamon rolls or thick, creamy, iced cinnamon rolls? I'll leave that up to you. Maybe you like soupy cinnamon rolls. Look at how well this filling stays within the cinnamon roll dough. It's really delicious. And if I turn my head just slightly, you will see our little helper Maggie come running. She absolutely loves cinnamon rolls. This is probably one of her favorite treats to have. So I always share just a little bit with her. We're going to look at this up close so that you can really see what this cinnamon roll looks like in just a second. My favorite part of the cinnamon roll is the very center. I don't know why. I just think it's the softest, most tender dough, and it just tastes absolutely amazing. What is your favorite part of the cinnamon roll? The crispy edges on the outside, the tender parts on the inside. Well, Gidget and friends, I really hope this helped you get the confidence you need to go ahead and make these cinnamon rolls. Maggie is absolutely thrilled that I made more cinnamon rolls, and she's saying, I hope you make these every day because I think they're absolutely delicious. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you for visiting us at jacksonsjob.com, and as always, happy baking.